Welcome to the Felt Dyslexic Artist interview. My name is Liz Buckridge. For me, as a dyslexic artist, other artists and creatives have always been my number one inspiration. In these interviews, we talk with artists and creatives who share their stories, and we gain insight into their process, from inspiration to art tips, career building, and more. We're so lucky to listen to the wisdom of Eric Picard today. I'm so excited to hear about his past and future projects and his insights on life as an artist. Hi, Eric.
Hello,
Thank you for talking with us today.
you're welcome.
I'm going to jump right in. Describe the art you make. What medium do you primarily work in, and why do you choose that medium?
Well, I work across a lot of different things. So today I'm mostly writing. So I've moved a little away from visual arts into creative writing. I've been working on a novel for the last several years. But historically, I've also uh, been a photographer and I've done some painting and drawing as well. But for the most part, photography when I'm doing visual work.
That's cool. Any other mediums that you could think of?
I've done some sculpture, I've done some painting, I've done some drawing, I've done a lot of printmaking. I've dabbled here and there in a lot of different things, but for the most part, day to day, the most often visual work that I make is photography.
Cool. How did you get into making art? Can you tell us about your background and how you first became interested in art?
I've always been interested in drawing. As a little kid, I was always drawing and, making stuff and uh, everything from crazy paper mache things to, you know, drawings of dinosaurs and things when I was little. What I found though was that that top 10% of visual artists, people who are incredibly skilled at just drawing and translating what they're thinking into drawing. I just never was that. I don't have that sort of natural skill. So as I got to be that age where you start worrying about how people think about you, it's like I stopped thinking of myself as being an artist. And then as I got older, I took a photo class and I started to really get into photography. And I was really fortunate to study with a guy named Bart Parker, who was a very well known within the photography community photographer. He was the guy that ran the program at the University of Rhode Island. And I found him just incredible to work with. He was a great guide. And as a result of that process, and just sort of discovering that I actually could build amazing things and change how people thought about the world. Um, I transitioned. So I was a history major in college, and I took so many photography and art classes that it turned out I only needed to go back to school for a little bit of time to get my fine arts degree. So I went back to school, got my fine arts degree. Bart asked if I would TA for him when I was an undergrad, which is very unusual, and I got to do that for a while, and then ultimately went to grad school for fine art and got my Master of Fine Arts at the University of Cincinnati.
Wow. How did you get into your specific style? What themes or subjects inspire your work?
This is Lebowski, by the way. He's
This is Lebowski.
he's cuddling with us. I'm sorry. Could you ask the question?
Yeah, I can. How did you get into your specific style? What themes or subjects inspire your work?
Um, I was always a very technical photographer when I was working in the darkroom. I started doing a lot of work like infrared photography and alternative processes, and I very foolishly plunged my hands into photochemistry too many times, including some direct positive chemistry to make positives instead of negatives. And I became incredibly sensitive to photochemistry. So within probably 7 or 8 years of starting to work in the darkroom and make a lot of kind of very technical photographs and very difficult to pull off kind of stuff, I suddenly, my hands would just swell up like balloons when I got photochemistry on them. So even if I get drops, like I would get big welts. So I began experimenting with computers, and at the time, to date myself, I there was one computer in the computer lab at the University of Rhode Island that had like Photoshop 2.1 on it, and I ended up going to grad school. Even though it was a photography program, it was completely digital, and which at the time was a big deal. Now nobody would think anything of that, but um, and at the University of Cincinnati, I transitioned off of photography and into interactive artwork. Um, I my under my graduate thesis was a virtual reality real-time 3D model of Newport, which at the time took a $1.3 million computer to run, and 2 years later it was a $64,000 computer. 2 years later it was a $20,000 computer, and now you can run it on my cell phone if I could find those files. So it was a really interesting time, and it was right around that time that um, the the whole kind of technology world thought that the next big thing was going to be virtual reality, and this was in the mid '90s. Turned out that wasn't the case. It was the internet, and I remember seeing my first beautiful website that somebody had built, one of my students in one of my classes, and it was I saw it and I had this moment and I was like, okay, the internet is going to be a huge game changing thing. And when I finished grad school, I started a company doing high end web development. And I hesitate to say web design because we were building like pretty involved stuff. And from there, I began to do technology for a living and started several companies, and I've worked at big technology companies and many small companies, and that's what I do for money. But what I found was that the same pool of energy that I would use to make art is the same pool of energy I would use to write. And it's the same pool of energy that I would use to start companies and to do business. So that creative flow and that creative energy, it's all pulling from the same place, from at least for me. Not everybody doesn't have that. But I think some people find making art pulling from very different from their day job, and they'll often they'll often make art to rejuvenate themselves. I don't ever really find that creative process as a rejuvenating process. I find it as one that has to have a lot of energy poured into it. So for me, the process of making art or starting a company or coming up with a new product idea for a company that I work for, it's all the same. So I tend to parcel out my energy and spend it as best I can. But
That's very cool. Um, do you consider yourself neurodivergent or neurotypical?
I am definitely neurodivergent. So I've inattentive type ADHD or ADD. The definitions keep floating around, but I have absolute attention focus. I think I thought of it as a disability at one point, but it's not at all. It's really more of a superpower. And for me, um, I can't add the number 7 and 9 in my head. I have to really stop and think about it. I use my fingers. Uh, really basic arithmetic stuff I just cannot do in my head. I understand pretty advanced math, but I can't do it because the building blocks of the stuff under it, but I actually understand it. And what that's turned out for me though is because I can't do those little building blocky kind of things, uh, I skip past it and I go right to much broader, more complex things. So from a technology perspective, I've worked with some of the best software developers in the world, people who are super geniuses, and I can work with them because I understand how they think and I understand what they're doing. And I have been told repeatedly that I give them good ideas. and ideas that are hard technically to pull off that they find as positive challenges. And it's kind of the same thing for me with other things. So with writing or with starting companies, or I think more at the ecosystem level or at the system level, and that plays out pretty heavily in artwork that I make, whether it's a book or whether it's something visual. I have a tendency to be thinking about things at a different level or a different place than other people are approaching it from, which is what I think great. I don't want to call myself a great artist, but what great artists do, right? Like I think the best artists have a different viewpoint that they bring to the table, and they see things and create things that are from a different point of view.
I agree. Have you faced any challenges or setbacks in your art career, and how did you overcome them?
Well, to say that I have an art career might be a bit of a stretch, only in that I've sold some art over the years, but for the most part, I make art and I either give it away or it's sitting in closets or in storage units. Maybe after I die, I'll be a famous artist. But I think the biggest setback I've had to making art is really finding the time, because I've had a pretty good career in the technology world, and finding time, like I said, it's the same pool of energy. I have really close friends who are painters and I think maybe I should try painting because maybe I would find it rejuvenating. But I have really close friends who work in technology and who are also painters, and they love it because they can get out of their head and paint. And for me, I would be very in my head to paint. So yeah, so far that's the biggest problem I've had, is really finding that the a way to tap into that pool of energy.
Where did you grow up?
Until I was 12, I grew up in a little town outside of Boston called Holbrook, which is near Braintree, on the South Shore. And when I was 12, we moved to Aquidneck Island. We lived in Middletown for a couple of years, and then moved to Newport in the seventh grade. So I grew up here in Newport, Rhode Island.
Did you do art when you were a little kid?
Tons. Yep. Many, many, many pieces, which got crumpled up and thrown away.
So this is my favorite subject, and I'm very curious what you're gonna say. Do you have a favorite colorway for your art, like a favorite palette? And is the colorway of your art different or the same as the colors in your house?
I would say different than the colors in my house. Maybe, but I don't have a particular palette that I use over and over, but I have a distinct palette that comes in bodies of work. So if I showed you a series of photographs that I took over about 6 months of time in any given period, you would see very distinct patterns in the palettes, but not. I don't know that it's very deliberate. I think it's just the way that I'm seeing the world at that time. Um, I At one point I had three different series of photographs I was making, and they were all very distinct and very different in different subject matters, and they all each individually had their own palettes, but they were not. Um, they were all taken simultaneously, like across the same time period. So yeah, I think depending on what I'm looking at and how I'm thinking about it, there's a tendency for those palettes to be similar.
Describe the space where you work, where you make your art. Where are we?
Yeah, we're here in a house that we recently bought just this summer. It is a building called the Conservatory. It was built in 1680. It's an old livery stable that was turned into a house in the 1970s. And the guy that we bought it from is is a sculptor, and he had a giant wood shop over that way. And we are going to be using the spaces for different purposes. And I don't really, I don't work in physical materials mostly. So for me, it's mostly computer. So this little office that we're sitting in is where I do all my work.
It's super cozy in here. How did your school system support your interest in art growing up?
You know, I was very fortunate, I think, when I was a young kid. The elementary schools that I went to were very much a product of the 70s. Very, um, it was a small suburban town on the outskirts of Boston, and we were very encouraged to do things. And I don't know how this happened, but when I was in the sixth grade, um, the school was too small for the number of students that we had, so they moved two of the sixth grade. Oh, sorry, this was fifth grade. Two of the fifth grade classes into the library, and they split it down the middle, and we had this big open air room. But the payoff for having to suffer through having this weird classroom was that we got to do lots of other things. So there was a group out of Boston that was like a performing arts studio, where we would get brought into downtown Boston and go to this studio 2 days a week for about half of that school year. And they brought us in, and they brought this other group of students from another school. We didn't quite get it at the time because we were in the fifth grade, but it was clearly like, we're going to take the somewhat wealthy suburban kids and some inner city kids and bring them in, and they're all going to learn how to do theater stuff together. Everything from making our own plays to making sets to doing creative projects, and it was really, really interesting. So I think that experience um, was unusual. And I think back at it now, and like the young people that were running this theater were all super hippies, like like super duper hippies. And it was fantastic. Like it was really great. So, but like that idea of okay, kids, we're gonna collaboratively make a play. Who's in charge? And somebody would be in charge of it. What do you think? And then you add your ideas to the play, and suddenly you have this play. And that was unusual, I think. I don't think that's a normal experience for most kids in an elementary school setting. And because of that, maybe because of that, or maybe I would have done this anyway, but I've always just been game, like to just create stuff, and to even things that are kind of ambitious. So uh, when I got to Newport, it was a little less so, but there were, the art programs were pretty decent. And I think it was more interesting that I gravitated toward people who were artists, in kids who were artists, but also adults. Like a lot of the adults that I knew in town were artists, and I was friends with children of artists. And so I've had a really pretty wonderful experience that way.
Um, how do you see your work evolving and changing in the future? What do you have planned?
I, I think I have a guess that over the course of the next few years, I'm going to probably move more into physical mediums and more away from digital. Um, I took, I did make some oil pastel work when during COVID, when I first moved back to Newport. Um, I spent about 3 weeks, and I just made about 30 oil pastel um, drawings, paintings. They're not really whatever you think of those as. And it was so rewarding. Just so I was just like, oh, I had to do more of this. But then, I got busy and was working and doing my stuff. And, it's a very easy thing for me to, um, especially with the iPhone being sort of so high end now, like relatively high end, you've always got a camera with you. The idea that you can just always be making work, um, it's just very easy. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll probably, I'm sure more of that because that's very easy. But I think I have a feeling I'm gonna start making some physical media work.
I love that. Is making art an emotional process for you or strategic?
I don't know if it's strategic, and I don't know how emotional it is. So it can be very emotional, but and especially writing for me can be very emotional. And there's, I guess, in writing there's both emotion and strategic. Um, but I think I would almost make a weird, very neurodivergent kind of statement, which is like, I don't know if it's strategic or tactical, right? Like if I'm making a photograph, I don't know how strategic I'm being, but I'm definitely thinking about the space that I'm in and the orientation of the camera to those shapes and colors, and that is a very that's kind of tactical, right? It's more like very zen, like I'm in a moment, I'm thinking about the this visual landscape. I have a little bit of knowledge about what changes I make to my camera settings or where the angles that I'm playing with, what those are going to do. But it's a very especially as you get older and you've just been doing this stuff so long, it's just like very zen, like very like gonna hit the target kind of a moment. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. Like but I don't know the answer.
Cool. Can you walk us through your creative process from idea to finished piece? You just started to sort of a little bit.
Yeah, and it depends on what I'm making. So I think I have to really think about it for a second, because if I have a variety of different kind of projects that I take on, and some of them are more like writing a novel, right? Even some of the visual photography projects I've done in the past have been more like writing a novel, where I'm thinking about, I don't know, highfalutin ideas, like things that are important, that I want to be getting these ideas across. One of the projects I did in grad school was a series of photographs of buildings that either almost touch or abut and actually do touch. And Newport is a great place to do that. I was at the time I was in Cincinnati, so I was walking around in downtown Cincinnati and taking pictures of these buildings, and I called that body of work Neighbors. But it was a very conceptual kind of a project, even though the individual photographs were just taken the way you take a photograph, and blocked and thought through and visually applied. But I was actively out seeking things that were of a type, right? And that's different than I have another photo series that I did. I was driving from my house in Washington State, which was way out in the middle of nowhere, to my office every day. And I would take this very long, windy road that was almost twice as long physically as taking the highway, but because of traffic, it was about the same time. And it was beautiful. And, you know, the weather is always so soft and damp and wet out there. And I, I was using a simple camera, like a simple lens camera, and taking these photographs while I was driving, like, so you get a lot of like lens flare and motion blur and all these things. And that's very zen, right? That's like but it's within a context that's maybe a little bit bigger. And then I've done a lot of other stuff in the past, especially when I was in my, undergrad and grad school, where I was like doodling in my notebook, trying to kind of come up with concepts. I did a whole series that was based on mythology, where I would recreate um, mythological sculptures from ancient Greek and Roman sculptures as photographs shot with infrared film that turned the texture of skin to almost like stone, but that were taken, with live people in modern settings. So I, I, I think it can be one, can be the other, can be a combination of the two.
Wow. Um, How do you combine the art you love to make and the art you sell?
Well, I don't have that problem because I'm not selling too much, but I, I will say that I don't know that I could. I'm thinking about it from a writing perspective. So I'm writing this novel, and I actually think that the novel maybe could be interesting. Maybe other people want to read it. Um, and I'm pretty, because I've worked in technology and business for a long time, I think I have a pretty good sense of how to product manage a product. And if I think of the novel that I'm writing as a product, I think I've incorporated things into it that would make it interesting to to market. But I don't know. It's a tricky one. I don't know.
How do people find anything of yours to purchase?
Well,
Do you have a website?
I don't currently have a website for things to purchase, but I do have a website with my writing. Um, and I've actually got two different websites for my writing. One that's for creative writing, and then another that's for essays that I've written. I do some public speaking and uh, sort of tale telling and storytelling, and usually after I finish one of those sort of things that I go out and speak about, I'll turn that into an essay and publish it. So I've got a few different places that people can go, and one of them is called Damp Pavement, which is literally ericpicard.wordpress.com. And the other one is I have a Medium um, blog that or publication that I write that is at Eric Picard at Medium.
Cool. We'll put that information in the show notes. Can you share a recent project or piece of work that you're particularly happy about?
Yeah, so I've been working on this novel now. If you count how long I've been thinking about this novel, I've been working on it for probably 30 years. But I've been working on this novel actually typing uh, since COVID. And I wrote probably 300 pages during COVID that um, I was mostly pleased with, but as I've lived with over time, I've become unpleased with. So I've taken it apart and I'm kind of doing surgery on it right now. But it's a historical novel that takes place in Idaho, in sort of northern Idaho, on the border of Idaho and Montana, outside of a town called Kellogg, Idaho. There was a huge gold rush and then a huge silver rush there, and the novel takes place over about 75 years in that historical period, and then it's interwoven with a modern story of the ancestors of those people who are coming back to that town that they sort of started during the gold rush. And um, it started with some thoughts I had about ghost towns and some ghost towns that I'd run into over the years. And when my wife and I were driving across the country, and we were taking a little, which we do often, so it's weird to say like that we took a different route than usual, but we saw this little sign on the side of the road, and it was probably about that big, and it said Garnet Ghost Town with an arrow. And we were driving on the highway, and I saw it. I said, "Hey, we should do that." She said, "Let's do it." And it was like, and we drove off, and we're driving through the woods for for like an hour, and we started to get a little like, oh, is this just like a trap? Like, are we going to some meth town here in the middle of the woods? We eventually came to this little ghost town called Garnet, which was a boom town during that same time period. It was on the Montana side of the border, and it's now I don't know if it's it's not a national park, but it's sort of managed by the national park system. and it was so cool. And we walked around, and like the idea that I've been working on for so long and just in my head suddenly crystallized, and I was like, okay, and that's what sort of led to this novel.
That's cool. How do you stay motivated as an artist?
It can be challenging, you know. I have a tendency to work when the mood strikes and to put things to the side and come back to them. Sometimes I will literally take years to come back to something. I have uh, several short stories that I've written that are that way. That I wrote. I wrote a short story in grad school uh, that got a lot of interest from people. I thought about publishing it, but then I went in other directions, and I picked it up again a few years ago and tuned it and published it. So that's actually available on Amazon. So as a novel, like you can download it, but it's more of a long short story, and that's called Sally Braid.
Are there any artists or creatives who influenced or inspired your work?
I mean, so many. I would say that um, especially when you get a formal education in art, like it, it becomes a whole thing. So for me, I I don't even know that I would call out any individual artists. I think the entire school of photographers who were like kind of documentarian photographers, a lot of the um, WPA artwork that was funded by the government during the Great Depression was really influential for me. I really love taking photographs of places and of people in places. So I've uh, really gravitated toward that type of work, and there are literally hundreds of artists, and like singling one out is a little bit of a challenge. But I think the from a writing perspective, and weirdly, I find that writing, for me at least, like reading novels, has been as influential about the artwork that I make as anything else. Um, and I think the one writer that I would call out from that perspective is Neil Stevenson, especially his historical fiction, like amazing to me. Um, there was one book that I was forced to read in grad school, and I was super resentful, and I hated it when I was reading it. But it's truly the most influential book on my that's influenced how I've worked on so many different areas of my work, not just artwork, but even my professional life. It was written by a woman named Brenda Laurel, who was it was her graduate thesis paper that she wrote as a theater graduate student, but she worked as one of the first game designers for Atari, and it's called Computers as Theater, and it's kind of a seminal work in interactive art and interactive design. Um, it should be required reading, I think, for anybody that's making video games or that's doing work in computer design. It's really pretty remarkable. Badly written, super hard to get through, but really important thinking.
What advice would you give to an aspiring artist looking to pursue a career in the arts?
Um, I would, so I have two children with art degrees, and um, I think it's very, very hard to make a living as an artist. So, as a dad, I've been really thoughtful about not tipping over too hard on having a backup plan, but more thinking about it pragmatically about how you make a living as an artist. Um, it's so tricky. There are always people who can make a living in the arts. Um, there are always people like I love um, the videos. Like there's a video of Jim Carrey who's at a college graduation ceremony, and he's saying, "Follow your heart." People said I couldn't do it, and my response to that is, very few people are Jim Carrey. Yes, you can make a living as an actor. You can make a living as a writer. You know, J.K. Rowling has made a vast fortune as a writer. It can happen. Um, you can start companies, and I've started 4 companies. You know, I'm not wealthy from any of them. You know, it's uh, most businesses fail, and I think if you think of your art career as a series of businesses, um, most businesses fail. So you kind of have to start over and reinvent yourself and keep at it and find new ways to approach it, and maybe be pragmatic and have a backup plan. But I think it's sort of about that grit and perseverance and creating your own luck and being willing to put yourself out there a little bit. I think the one thing I say to my kids is that ambition is one of the most vilified, important traits in the world, and that it's also incredibly rare. And it's okay to be ambitious. It's okay to want to change the world. It's okay to want lots of people to look at your work, or lots of people to, it's okay to want to make a lot of money if that's what you want to do. So being ambitious and having drive to do something is not a trait to root out. It's a trait to embrace and to nurture and to really play with as you're going.
I agree. What is your favorite book, movie, song, or podcast?
I will call out a book and a movie. So my favorite book series, I mentioned Neil Stephenson, is The Baroque Cycle by Neil Stephenson. It's a fantastic, I think it's probably 3,000 pages across all these books. That he's a prolific writer. It takes place during uh, the Baroque period. It's about the beginning. It sounds really boring when you tell people about this book. It's about the beginnings of science and mathematics and finance, but he wraps it in a wrapper of a swashbuckling pirate tale, and main characters are like Isaac Newton and some other folks. It's quite excellent. Um, as far as movies go, I'm a huge movie fanatic. My favorite movie of all time is a movie called About Time, and I, it's another one that's a little bit of a twist. It's a movie that sort of masquerades as a romantic comedy, but it is wrapped in a wrapper of time travel, almost science fiction, and it's really truly a story about the love between a father and a son.
Is there a book that you recommend over and over again that's different?
Computers as Theater, which I mentioned earlier, is one that I have recommended to probably 1,000 people. uh, and I always caveat by saying it's miserable. You will hate reading it, but it's really important to read. Um, so that's the one I'm going with.
What would you like to talk about that I didn't ask?
Oh, geez. Uh, I think especially in a world that is increasingly digital and increasingly um, people are not given the opportunity to do mark making and physical work, that it's really, really important for people to do that on their own, um, whether it's as simple as literally writing things on paper or making things physically. it's really important to develop that practice. It forges different neurological connections in your brain and in your body, and it's a very, very healthy thing to do. So I think people really need to do that more.
Yes. Thank you so much, Eric, for letting us into your studio today. I felt inspired for sure. Much love, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, and thanks for doing this. This is great.
Yay!